I thought my dad was just extremely overweight and helpless. But the truth was even crazier. Ever since my mom left us, my dad became a food maniac. What started as a routine trip to Wawa at 3 a.m. soon escalated into owing thousands of dollars to Klarna DoorDash. And in just 2 years, my dad grew to a whopping 340 pounds. At first, I figured that binge eating was at least a better coping mechanism than alcohol or Fent. But that was before I turned into my dad's full-time nurse and maid. I had to play academic catch-up for all of senior year because my dad needed help going to the toilet. I lost all my friends because someone labeled me as a daddy's girl, and that was basically social sewer slide. So when my scholarship acceptance letter arrived that day in April, I thought, this is it. This is my chance to finally be a normal girl again. To have normal problems and complain about normal things. It took me 3 days to finally muster up the courage to tell my dad. I was feeding him the triple baconator from Wendy's when it happened. Dad, I have something to tell you. Can't. Breathe. Suddenly he was clutching his chest and gasping. When the paramedics arrived, they said his weight was crushing his organs. The doctor pulled me aside with this grave look and said he needed round-the-clock care or he wouldn't make it to Christmas. I was supposed to leave for MIT in 4 months. Just defer for 1 semester. Dad wheezed from his hospital bed, his voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. Just until I get better, sweetheart. I can't lose you too. What kind of monster leaves their dying father? So I called MIT. They were understanding, said my spot would wait. Except 1 semester became 2, then a full year. Every single time I tried to make plans to leave, something happened. The night before spring enrollment, Dad collapsed in the bathroom. Turned out to be stomach gas, but I'd already missed the deadline by the time we got back from the ER. When fall registration opened, he had a panic attack so severe he forgot his own name. I spent 3 days in the hospital with him instead of filling out forms. I became his everything. His nurse when he couldn't reach his insulin. His cook when he'd order enough Panda Express for 6 people then cry about mom until I agreed to eat with him. His therapist when he'd wake up screaming at 3 a.m. I was showering a grown man, wiping drool off his chin, washing his sheets when he had accidents. My hands were raw from bleach. I hadn't slept through a full night in months. The thing that broke me was when MIT called in February. My advisor's voice was sympathetic but firm. This is your final chance. If you're not here by fall, we have to give your spot to someone else. I felt my future evaporating as she spoke. That night, I told Dad I was leaving. Had to. This was my last shot. His face went pale. His breathing got shallow. My chest, he gasped, clutching at his shirt. Need hospital. But something felt off this time. Maybe it was how quickly he peeked at my face between gasps, or how his panic seemed so perfectly timed. While he was in the bathroom, I grabbed his medical folder from the kitchen drawer, the one he always kept locked. Started flipping through his recent test results. Then I found the most recent cardiology report from last month. His heart was fine. Had been for 6 months. The cardiologist's notes were clear. Patient's cardiac function normal for someone of his weight. No immediate danger. I stared at those papers until the words blurred. Then I heard his voice through the bathroom door. Low and clear. Not breathless at all. Yeah, she's staying. Bought the whole thing again. My entire body went cold. I pressed my ear to the door. Nah, she doesn't suspect anything. Few more years and she'll age out of those programs. Then she'll have no choice but to stay here and take care of me. I must have made a noise because he stopped talking. When he came out, he was back to wheezing, clutching his chest. I smiled and helped him to bed. But inside, something had shattered. Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own home. While he slept, I went through everything. Credit card statements showed monthly charges to Optimum Nutrition. His browser history, which he'd forgotten to clear, had searches for how to gain weight fast and maintaining obesity for disability. But it wasn't until I checked his closet, behind the boxes of mom's old stuff he claimed were too painful to move, that I found them. Tubs and tubs of serious mass gainer. The 12-pound bags, some empty, some full, all dated within the last year. Behind those, a notebook. His handwriting. Weight goals with target dates. Meal plans designed to pack on pounds. A spreadsheet calculating exactly how much he needed to weigh to keep his disability checks and keep me from leaving. The final entry, dated last week. She almost left this time. Need to hit 350 by March. I stood there in his closet, surrounded by evidence that my father had been destroying my life on purpose, and felt nothing. Just empty. Then I heard him calling from his bed. That fake wheeze in his voice. Honey, I need help getting up. I grabbed one of the tubs and walked to his room. He was sprawled on the bed, already starting his performance. But when he saw what I was holding, his eyes went wide. Not confused, not sick, just caught. How long, Dad? My voice didn't even sound like mine. And for the first time in 2 years, I saw who my father really was. His mouth curved into this sick smile as he opened his mouth to say, "Since when does it matter what I do? You're not going anywhere anyway." The words hit me like cold water. No wheezing, no gasping, just his normal voice, maybe even stronger than normal. He pushed himself up against the headboard, and I watched his whole body move differently, like someone who'd been faking a limp suddenly walking fine. "You think you're so smart with your little investigation," he said, and his voice had this edge I'd never heard before. "Yeah, I gained the weight on purpose. So what? You really think MIT still wants you after 2 years of deferments? They're just being polite, sweetie." I set the tub down on his nightstand, my hands shaking but my voice steady. I found the notebook too. The spreadsheet, the browser history, all of it. His face went white, actually white, and for a second he looked scared. Then something changed in his eyes, and I realized I was seeing my father's real face for maybe the first time ever. Not the grieving husband, not the sick patient, just this cold, calculating person who'd been playing me like a game. He switched tactics so fast it made my head spin. His eyes filled with tears and his voice cracked as he started talking about Mom. I was so scared of losing you, like I lost her. The loneliness was killing me, honey. You're all I have left. That familiar guilt started rising in my chest. That automatic response I'd had for 2 years whenever he cried. But then I remembered the spreadsheet. The one that calculated exactly when I'd age out of scholarship programs. And the guilt just died. It couldn't take root anymore. I'm leaving for MIT in August, I said. And my voice was shaking, but I kept going. Nothing you do is going to stop me this time. He moved so fast I didn't see it coming. He lunged forward and grabbed my arm, his fingers tight around my wrist, and he moved like someone who could definitely get out of bed without help. I jerked back hard, so hard I stumbled sideways into his dresser and the corner dug into my hip. For a second, we just stared at each other. He looked shocked, genuinely shocked, like he was seeing himself through my eyes for the first time and didn't like what he saw. He let go of my arm and fell back against his pillows, but I noticed something. He wasn't clutching his chest, wasn't gasping for breath. The whole medical crisis act was just gone, abandoned completely. Get out of my room, he said quietly, and I did. I grabbed my phone and my keys and I left. I didn't pack a bag, didn't plan anything, just got in my car and drove until I found a 24-hour grocery store and pulled into the parking lot. I sat there in the dark with my hands still shaking, and that's when my phone started buzzing. Text after text from him. First apologizing, then accusing me of being cruel, then apologizing again. Around 3 a.m., he started sending photos of Mom, old pictures from when they were happy, and I turned my phone off. I couldn't look at it anymore. I slept in my car that night, or tried to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that cold, calculating look when he dropped the act. The next morning, I drove straight to the public library as soon as it opened. The librarian gave me a weird look, probably because I was wearing yesterday's clothes and my hair was a mess, but I didn't care. I found a computer in the back corner and started searching. Caregiver manipulation, financial abuse of adult children, parents faking illness for control. The articles that came up made my stomach hurt. There was even something called Munchausen by proxy in reverse, where people fake their own illnesses to get attention and control from family members. Every article I read described my life for the past 2 years. I sat there reading until my eyes burned, and then I drove back to the house while I knew he'd be asleep. I had maybe 2 hours before he usually woke up. I went straight to his closet and started taking photos of everything. Every page of the notebook, every tub of mass gainer with the dates visible, every empty container. My hands were steady now in a way they weren't last night. I wasn't scared anymore, just focused. I took screenshots of his browser history before he could delete it, photos of the credit card statements showing the optimum nutrition charges. I documented everything like I was building a case, because that's exactly what I was doing. I was done being his victim. By the time I heard him starting to move around in his room, I had everything saved in 3 different places. Then I sat in my car outside and made the call I should have made months ago. I dialed MIT's main number and asked for Evelyn Chandler. She answered on the 3rd ring, and her voice had that professional but friendly tone I remembered from our previous calls. This is Evelyn. I took a breath. This is about my deferred enrollment. I need to tell you something about why I kept missing deadlines. As I explained what I'd discovered, what my father had been doing, her tone changed. It got softer, more personal. I suspected something wasn't right, she said. The pattern of emergencies, always at the last possible moment. I've dealt with family manipulation cases before. She paused. Your spot is still available for fall enrollment, but I need to ask, are you safe? Do you need resources for your current situation? And that's when I started crying for the first time since I found the notebook. Not because I was sad, but because someone finally believed me. Evelyn asked if I could stay on the line for a minute, and I heard her talking to someone in the background. When she came back, she said her husband worked with these kinds of situations, and could I talk to him right now? I said yes before I even thought about it. A man's voice came on the line and introduced himself as Eric. He worked as a social worker and dealt with elder abuse and family manipulation cases. He asked if I felt safe, and I told him I was in my car in a parking lot. He started asking questions about my father's actual medical problems versus the emergencies that stopped me from enrolling. I pulled up the photos on my phone while we talked and started going through them one by one. The cardiology report showing normal heart function, the notebook with weight goals, the browser history about maintaining obesity. Eric listened without interrupting, and I realized as I talked that I was describing a pattern I'd never seen clearly before. The bathroom collapse that was just gas happened the night before spring enrollment. The panic attack where Dad forgot his name happened during fall registration. Every single crisis timed perfectly to make me miss a deadline. Eric asked about my father's real conditions, and I listed them off. High blood pressure, prediabetes, joint problems from the weight. All manageable with medication and diet changes. None of them actually life-threatening. Eric explained that what my father did wasn't technically illegal, but it fell into this gray area of psychological abuse and financial exploitation. If I could prove the deliberate deception, it might help with disability fraud charges, but the manipulation itself was hard to prosecute. He said the best thing I could do was document everything and get myself out. I thanked him and hung up, feeling like someone had finally given me permission to save myself. I drove back to the house while Dad was sleeping and grabbed more of my stuff. Clothes, laptop, the folder with all my MIT paperwork. I was shoving things into garbage bags when my phone buzzed with a message from someone I hadn't talked to in over a year. Roxana Mathis from high school, asking if I was okay because she saw my vague post about needing space. I stared at her message for a long time before typing back that I was leaving my father's house and didn't have anywhere to go. She responded immediately with her address and said I could crash at her apartment for a few days. Roxana lived 20 minutes away in a small one-bedroom place. She opened the door and didn't ask questions when she saw my garbage bags. Just helped me carry them inside and pointed to her couch. She made coffee and we sat there in her tiny kitchen and I told her everything. The mass gainer, the notebook, the fake emergencies. She listened with her mouth hanging open, and when I finished, she said that explained why I disappeared senior year. I spent 3 days at her place sleeping on her couch, and it was the most peaceful 3 days I'd had in 2 years. She went to work during the day, and I used her Wi-Fi to research what came next. I found the number from my father's doctor's office and called to request a meeting. The receptionist asked why, and I said I was his primary caregiver making decisions about his long-term care needs. It wasn't technically true anymore, but it got me an appointment for the next afternoon. My phone rang while I was looking up disability fraud reporting. Roxana's number showed on the screen, but when I answered, it was my father's voice. He was gasping and wheezing and telling Roxana I'd abandoned my sick father, and he was going to die alone. Roxana raised her eyebrows at me from across the room, and I put the phone on speaker. Dad's breathing sounded terrible and dramatic and fake as hell now that I knew what to listen for. I waited until he finished his performance and then said very calmly that I knew he was faking, that I'd found the notebook and the mass gainer and I knew everything. The wheezing stopped immediately. Complete silence on the other end. Then he started yelling about how ungrateful I was, and I hung up. Roxana looked at me with wide eyes and asked if I was okay. I said I was better than okay. I was done. Dr. Ferguson's office smelled like antiseptic and old magazines. The receptionist checked me in, and I sat in the waiting room rehearsing what I was going to say. When the nurse called my name, I followed her back to a small office where Dr. Ferguson was sitting behind a desk covered in files. He stood up to shake my hand and asked what I wanted to discuss. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos. The notebook first, then the mass gainer containers, then his own medical reports showing my father's heart was fine. Dr. Ferguson's face went from professional to uncomfortable as he looked through everything. He sat back in his chair and was quiet for a minute. Then he admitted that my father's recent test results had shown improvement in several areas. His blood pressure was better. His pre-diabetes markers were stable. It contradicted everything my father had been telling me about getting worse. I asked him to explain my father's actual condition, and he pulled up the medical records on his computer. He said my father's weight was genuinely dangerous and put stress on his organs. But his cardiac function was actually better than expected for someone his size. His heart was working fine. His lungs were okay. He was mobile and capable of self-care. Dr. Ferguson mentioned he'd been treating my father for anxiety and depression too, and I felt my stomach drop. Dad never told me about mental health treatment. Never mentioned therapy or medication for anything except the physical problems. The doctor explained the prescriptions I'd found in the bathroom, and I realized my father had been hiding an entire part of his medical care from me. I asked the question I'd been scared to ask. If I left my father alone, would he die? Dr. Ferguson looked at me for a long time before answering. He said no. My father was mobile enough to care for himself. His conditions were manageable with medication and dietary changes. He wasn't in immediate danger. The answer felt like someone had unlocked a cage I'd been living in. I thanked him and left before I started crying in his office. I looked up the disability office address and drove there the same day. The building was gray and depressing with fluorescent lights that buzzed. I asked to speak to whoever handled my father's case, and they sent me to a small cubicle where a woman named Monica Stinson was typing on a computer. She asked how she could help, and I said I needed to file a report about disability fraud. Monica's expression shifted from bored to interested. I showed her everything on my phone. The notebook with weight maintenance goals and timelines. The mass gainer purchases. The browser history about maintaining obesity for benefits. She was skeptical at first and asked a lot of questions about how I got this information. I explained I was my father's caregiver and found it while cleaning his room. Monica took photos of my phone screen and filled out paperwork while I answered more questions. She explained that disability fraud investigations took months, and she couldn't promise any specific outcome. But she'd flag his case for review and someone would contact him for a reassessment. Then she said something that made my whole body relax. I had no legal obligation to provide care for my father. Adult children weren't required by law to take care of their parents. She suggested I contact Adult Protective Services to arrange alternative care if I was planning to leave. I asked what would happen to Dad if I just left, and she said he'd have to figure out his own care like any other adult. The system would help him find resources, but he'd have to participate. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in 2 years. I spent the next 3 days at Roxana's apartment barely sleeping. My phone kept buzzing with calls from Dad that I let go to voicemail. Each message started apologetic, then turned angry, then desperate. I deleted them without listening all the way through. Roxana gave me her couch and didn't ask questions when I'd wake up at 2 a.m. and just sit there staring at nothing. On the third night, I was making coffee in her kitchen when someone started pounding on her door so hard the whole frame shook. Roxana came out of her bedroom looking scared, and I already knew who it was before I heard his voice yelling my name. He was screaming that I was killing him by keeping his medications from him, and that he needed help right now. Roxana grabbed her phone and called 911 while I stood frozen in her kitchen. The pounding got louder, and he started saying he was having chest pains and couldn't breathe. I heard her neighbors opening their doors, and Dad's voice got even louder, telling anyone who would listen that his daughter had abandoned him to die. The police showed up maybe 10 minutes later, but it felt like hours. I heard them talking to Dad in the hallway, asking him to calm down and step back from the door. He tried to tell them I had his medications, and he was in medical distress. But one of the officers asked him how he drove here if he was having a medical emergency. There was this long pause before Dad said his neighbor drove him. The officer asked where the neighbor was now, and Dad couldn't answer. They asked if they could look in his car, and Dad got real quiet. Roxana opened the door a crack and told the officers I was staying with her, and that my father had been harassing us. One of them asked if I wanted to come out and talk, and I did, even though my legs felt like water. Dad was leaning against the hallway wall, breathing hard and sweating, but the officers weren't buying it anymore. One of them came back from checking his car, and I saw him show his partner something on his phone. They asked Dad to come downstairs with them, and he started the whole chest pain act again. The younger officer just looked tired and told him they found his medications in his car, along with bags from McDonald's and Taco Bell and some big plastic containers. Dad's face went red, and he tried to explain that he needed those supplements for a medical condition, but the officer cut him off. They told him he needed to leave the property immediately, and that if he came back, they'd arrest him for harassment. Dad looked at me then like I'd stabbed him in the back. The older officer walked him to his car while his partner stayed with me and Roxana. He asked if this had been going on a while, and I just nodded. He said I should think about getting a restraining order if Dad kept showing up places. He gave me a card with a case number and told me to call if there were any more problems. After they left, I sat on Roxana's couch and started shaking so hard my teeth chattered. She brought me a blanket and sat next to me without saying anything. My phone rang an hour later, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Dad's voice came through cold and mean in a way I'd never heard before. He said I'd spoken to his doctor and his caseworker, and I knew he was capable of taking care of himself. There was this long silence where I could hear him breathing. Then he said I was just like my mother, selfish and cruel. I opened my mouth to argue, but he kept going. He told me Mom didn't actually leave him. He said he drove her away with his neediness and manipulation, and now he was doing the same thing to me. His voice broke on the last part, and I realized this might be the first completely honest thing he'd said to me in 2 years. I hung up without responding and blocked his number. That night, I Googled my Uncle Corey, who I hadn't seen since I was maybe 12. He'd moved to Oregon after some fight with Dad and never came back for holidays. I found him on social media and sent a message explaining everything. He called me the next morning. When I told him about the mass gainer and the notebook and the fake emergencies, there was this long silence. Then he said he wasn't surprised. He told me Dad did something similar to their mother before she died, made himself so helpless she couldn't leave him even when she got sick herself. Corey said Dad has always used helplessness as a weapon, and drove away everyone in his life who wouldn't enable him. He said Mom left because she couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. The way he said it made me feel less guilty somehow. Corey offered to help me get to MIT and said he'd check on Dad periodically, but he wouldn't become his caretaker. He'd learned that lesson already. I started making real plans after that call. I opened a new bank account at a different bank where Dad couldn't access it and transferred what little money I had saved. I drove to Roxana's apartment with all my important documents, my birth certificate and social security card and high school transcripts. She cleared out a drawer in her dresser for my stuff. I called MIT Housing and explained my situation to a woman who sounded maybe 60. She asked careful questions about whether I was safe, and when I told her about the police visit, she said they'd fast-track my housing application. 2 weeks later, Dad tried another medical emergency. I was at Roxana's when I got the call from the hospital saying they'd brought him in. I drove there more out of habit than anything else. The same paramedics who'd come before were in the ER, and I saw the skeptical looks on their faces when they saw me. One of them told me they'd found Dad conscious and arguing with them about whether he needed to go to the hospital. The ER doctor came out after an hour and asked to speak with me privately. She pulled up Dad's chart on a computer and showed me the pattern of emergency visits over the past 2 years. None of them resulted in admission. She asked me directly if I felt safe at home with him. I told her I was moving out, and she just nodded like that made sense. She said she was ordering a social work consult for Dad's discharge planning. The social worker who came was younger than me and had this judgmental look when she started talking about Dad's vulnerability and how he needed family support. I pulled out my phone and showed her everything. The notebook photos, the mass gainer purchases, the browser history. I watched her face change as she scrolled through it all. She stopped talking about my obligations and started asking questions about Dad's actual capabilities. When she went to talk to Dad, I heard him yelling at her through the door about how I was abandoning him. She came back out looking shaken and said she'd be recommending outpatient mental health services and nutrition counseling. She gave me pamphlets about meal delivery and home health aides he could hire himself. I left them at the nurse's station and walked out while Dad was still in his room. The hospital discharged Dad 2 days later with a folder full of papers about mental health treatment and food counseling programs. The social worker handed him brochures for meal delivery services and companies that hire home health aides. Dad shoved them all back across the table and told her he didn't need strangers in his house. He had me. The social worker looked at me and I shook my head. Dad's face went red and he demanded I take him home right now. I told him to call an Uber and walked out while he was still yelling my name down the hallway. My hands shook the whole drive to Roxana's place, but I didn't turn around. I went back to the house the next morning while Dad was still at the hospital figuring out his ride situation. Roxana came with me and we moved fast, loading my car with clothes and books and my laptop. I didn't have much after 2 years of living like his nurse. 4 boxes of stuff, 1 suitcase, my backpack. We cleared out my room in under 2 hours. Roxana asked if I wanted any kitchen stuff and I said no, let him keep it all. I wasn't taking anything that reminded me of feeding him or cleaning up after him. We were done and gone in 4 hours total. I left a note on the kitchen table explaining I'd enrolled at MIT for fall and would be leaving in 6 weeks. I put the meal delivery brochures next to it, along with Dr. Ferguson's card and Uncle Corey's phone number written on a sticky note. Dad got home around dinner time based on the Ring camera notification on my phone. I was at Roxana's apartment when I saw him climb out of an Uber, moving faster than he'd moved in months when he thought I was watching. He went inside and the calls started 20 minutes later. 30 calls in 3 hours. I let them all go to voicemail until number 31 when I finally answered. He was crying, asking where I was, saying the house felt empty and wrong. I told him I was staying with Roxana until I left for school, that I'd pay my half of rent through August when our lease ended, and he needed to figure out his own care plan because I was done. His voice changed instantly, got cold and mean. He said if I didn't come home he'd kill himself, that my mom left him and now I was leaving him and he had nothing left to live for. I felt that old panic rising in my chest but pushed it down. I told him I was reporting that threat to crisis services and hung up. Then I called the number the social worker had given me and reported exactly what he'd said. The crisis counselor called me back 3 hours later. She'd sent someone to do a welfare check and found Dad angry but totally fine, not suicidal at all. She said he'd admitted he was trying to get me to come back home and take care of him. They referred him to outpatient mental health services and documented the whole thing in his file. I called Eric the next day to tell him what happened and he said the documentation was important, that it created a paper trail if Dad tried to escalate further. He asked if I felt safe and I realized I actually did for the first time in years. I got a job at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Roxana's apartment to save money for moving costs and supplies I'd need at the school. The interview took 15 minutes and they hired me on the spot to start the next day. My first shift felt completely weird. Standing behind a counter making lattes while customers complained about the wait time or the temperature of their drinks. One woman went off on me because we were out of oat milk and I almost laughed in her face. Your biggest problem today is oat milk. My biggest problem 2 weeks ago was showering my father and wondering if I'd ever escape. I smiled and apologized and offered her almond milk instead. My coworkers complained about difficult customers and scheduling conflicts, and I just nodded along, thinking how simple and normal their problems seemed. Dad tried a different approach after 2 weeks of me not responding to his regular calls. He left a voicemail that sounded totally different. Quiet and sad instead of angry. He said he'd been thinking about everything and realized he needed professional help for his food addiction and his depression. He said he was sorry for what he'd done and asked if we could have dinner to talk things through. I listened to that message 5 times, trying to figure out if it was real or just another trick. Part of me wanted to believe he was finally being honest, that maybe hitting bottom had made him see what he'd become. I called him back and agreed to meet at a restaurant, somewhere public where he couldn't fake a medical emergency. The restaurant was a diner halfway between Roxana's place and our old house. I got there 10 minutes early and sat in a booth facing the door. Dad showed up 20 minutes late, breathing hard as he walked across the parking lot. He'd lost some weight, maybe 10 pounds, but he was still huge, still taking up too much space. He made this big production of squeezing into the booth across from me, huffing and adjusting himself while other diners glanced over. The waitress came and he ordered water and a salad, which would have been progress except I saw him looking at the menu like he was planning what to order after I left. He started talking before I could say anything, apologizing for everything he'd put me through. He said he'd scheduled an appointment with a therapist for next week and had a consultation with a bariatric specialist about weight loss options. It all sounded good, sounded real, until he said the actual reason he'd wanted to meet. He asked if I'd consider deferring MIT 1 more semester, just until he got through the initial treatment phase and established some healthy routines. He said it would mean everything to have my support during this hard time, that he was finally ready to change but needed help getting started. I stared at him across the table and felt something click into place. This was just another manipulation, same as all the others, just dressed up in therapy language. I told him no, told him I was leaving in 4 weeks no matter what he did with his health, that his recovery was his responsibility, and I wasn't deferring anything ever again. His face changed, that mask slipping again like it had in his bedroom. He got loud, his voice rising as he said I was abandoning him when he needed me most. That what kind of daughter walks away from her father who's trying to get help? Other diners turned to stare at us. The waitress paused mid-step across the room. Dad kept going, saying I was selfish just like Mom, saying I'd regret this when he was dead. I stood up while he was mid-sentence, grabbed my bag and walked out. I heard him calling my name behind me, but I didn't stop, didn't look back, just got in my car and drove away. I blocked his number that night. The next week I got a call from an unknown number at work and almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Evelyn from MIT and her voice had this edge to it I hadn't heard before. She asked if I was aware my father had called the admissions office claiming there was a family medical emergency requiring me to defer enrollment again. My stomach dropped. I told her it wasn't true, that he was trying to manipulate the situation, and I could hear her typing notes as I explained what had been happening. She said she was flagging his contact information in their system and documenting this attempt at interference. Nobody from my family would be able to affect my enrollment status going forward. She asked if I needed any other support resources, and I almost cried right there in the middle of my shift at the coffee shop. The letter came 3 days later. Thick envelope, law firm logo in the corner, my name spelled wrong. I opened it standing by the mailbox and felt my hands start shaking as I read. A lawyer my father hired was claiming I had legal responsibility for his care and threatening action if I abandoned him. The letter used words like elder abuse and negligence and financial obligation. It said I could face criminal charges. I called Eric immediately and read him the whole thing over the phone. He was quiet for a minute, then asked me to send him photos of every page. When I did, he called back within an hour. He said the letter was complete garbage, that adult children have zero legal obligation to provide care for parents in our state. The lawyer was using intimidation tactics and banking on me not knowing my rights. Eric said the letter itself might actually be unethical depending on what the lawyer knew about the situation. Eric connected me with a legal aid clinic and we drafted a response together over the next few days. The response laid out clear boundaries, included documentation of my father's manipulation pattern, and made it obvious I knew my legal rights. We sent it certified mail to the lawyer's office. I never heard back. Eric told me later, after doing some checking, that my father had stopped paying the lawyer after their first meeting when the lawyer explained the case had no legal basis. The whole thing had been another manipulation attempt, just with a lawyer's letterhead this time. 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave for MIT, my father showed up at the coffee shop during my closing shift. I was wiping down tables when I looked up and saw him squeezing through the door. He'd clearly driven himself there, which meant all those times he claimed he couldn't fit in a car had been lies too. My manager was at the register and I saw her notice him. Saw her eyes flick to me with this questioning look. My father started talking loud enough for everyone to hear, saying I was neglecting my dying father, that I was abandoning him when he needed me most. Customers stopped mid-conversation and stared. I felt my face get hot, but I kept wiping the same table over and over, not looking at him. My manager came out from behind the counter and asked him to leave. He ignored her and kept going, his voice getting louder, saying what kind of daughter does this to her own father. My manager told him again to leave or she'd call the police. He turned on her then, started saying she was enabling me, that she should be ashamed for supporting this. That's when my manager pulled out her phone and started dialing. My father looked at me one more time, his face red and sweating, then turned and left. After he was gone, my manager locked the door even though we weren't supposed to close for another hour. She asked if I was okay, and I nodded, but my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't hold the cleaning spray. She said he was banned from the property, and if he came back she'd call the cops immediately. Then she sent me home early and told me to take the next day off. I agreed to one last conversation with my father, but only at our house and only with Uncle Corey on video call as a witness. Corey had offered after I told him about the coffee shop incident, said he wanted to be there to back me up. My father showed up exactly on time, which was unusual for him. I had my laptop set up on the kitchen table with Corey's face on the screen. My father looked between me and the laptop and something in his expression shifted when he realized his brother was watching. He started with apologies, his voice breaking as he said he was sorry for everything. Then he switched to anger, saying I was tearing the family apart, that Uncle Corey had no right to interfere. He cycled through emotions so fast it was hard to keep up. Crying about how much he missed Mom, then raging about how I was just like her, then begging me to stay just a few more months. Uncle Corey stayed quiet, just watching, and his silence seemed to make my father more frantic. I sat there listening to him go through his entire repertoire of manipulation tactics and felt nothing but tired. There was nothing I could say that would make him take responsibility. He wasn't going to suddenly realize what he'd done. He was going to keep cycling through these same patterns forever, and I was choosing to step off the ride. I looked at my father across the kitchen table and said I loved him, but I couldn't save him. I told him he'd been trying to drown me to keep himself afloat, and I was choosing to swim away. His face went pale and his mouth opened. But before he could speak, Uncle Corey's voice came through the laptop speakers. Corey said he'd watched our father do the same thing to their mother years ago, that the pattern was identical, and he wasn't going to sit by and watch it destroy another family member. My father turned toward the laptop screen and started yelling at Corey, saying he didn't understand, that it was different. Corey just shook his head and said it wasn't different at all, that our father had been manipulating people his whole life, and it was time for it to stop. My father stood up so fast his chair fell over backward. He looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, something between rage and desperation and genuine fear. Then he grabbed his keys off the counter and left without another word. My father's final attempt came 5 days later. I was at Roxana's apartment packing when my phone rang with a hospital number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was my father, his voice weak and gasping, saying he was dying and needed me there. He'd stopped taking his medications, and now his blood pressure was through the roof. I hung up and called Dr. Ferguson instead. The doctor's voice was careful when he answered, professional but clearly frustrated. He confirmed my father had deliberately skipped several days of medications to create a crisis. His blood pressure was elevated but not dangerous, and he was discharged with a recommendation for psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Ferguson said my father had admitted to stopping the medications when the ER doctor confronted him about the timing. The hospital staff had seen this pattern before, and they weren't going to admit him for a manufactured emergency. The psychiatric evaluation happened the next day. The results came through Dr. Ferguson, who called me directly. The evaluation found my father mentally competent, and not an actual danger to himself despite his claims. But it noted serious depression and anxiety that needed treatment. He'd been given referrals and resources for therapy and medication management. Dr. Ferguson's voice was gentle when he told me my father had refused all of it. He'd told the psychiatrist his only problem was that I was abandoning him, that he'd be fine if I just stayed. The doctor had tried to explain that wasn't how treatment worked, but my father wouldn't hear it. Dr. Ferguson asked if I was still planning to leave for school, and when I said yes, he said that was probably the healthiest choice I could make. My last week before MIT was a blur of packing and goodbyes. Roxana helped me sort through everything I owned and decide what to take versus what to leave behind. I didn't have much after 2 years of being trapped in that house. Most of my high school stuff was gone, donated, or thrown out during one of Dad's cleaning fits. Roxana and I spent one whole afternoon just sitting on her apartment floor going through boxes, and she told me she was proud of me for getting out. She'd become a real friend through this nightmare, one of the only people who understood what I'd been going through. Eric called me that week too, just to check in. He reminded me that guilt was just proof I cared, but caring didn't mean I had to set myself on fire to keep someone else warm. I wrote that down in my phone so I wouldn't forget it. The night before I was supposed to leave, my father showed up at Roxana's apartment building. I was doing final packing when the intercom buzzed. Roxana answered it, and her face went tight when she heard his voice. She held the intercom button down so I could hear him. He was begging me through the speaker to reconsider, his voice breaking with sobs. He said he'd do anything, change anything, if I just gave him one more chance. I took the intercom from Roxana and pressed the talk button. I told him I hoped he got the help he needed and that I'd check in with him sometimes, but I was leaving tomorrow and nothing would change that. He started to respond, but I let go of the button. Through Roxana's window, I could see his car in the parking lot, could see his shape behind the wheel. He sat there for almost 3 hours while I finished packing. Roxana and I didn't talk much, just moved around each other in her small apartment, both of us hyper-aware of his presence outside. Finally, around midnight, I saw his headlights come on. I watched him pull out of the parking lot and drive away, and I felt something break loose in my chest that had been stuck there for 2 years. Since you found out. His voice was flat and cold. No more fake wheezing or tears. I knew you'd figure it out eventually, but I thought I had more time. I stood there holding that mass gainer tub and felt my hands start shaking, not from fear but from pure rage that had nowhere to go. He sat up straighter in bed, moving easier than he had in months, and I realized how much of his helplessness had been performance. I asked him why, and my voice cracked on the word. He shrugged like we were discussing the weather and said he couldn't lose me too, that he'd already lost Mom and losing me would kill him, so he had to make sure I stayed. I told him he didn't lose Mom. He drove her away, and now he was doing the same thing to me. His face twisted up and he started to cry. Real tears this time, but I was so far past caring about his tears. I grabbed my phone off his nightstand and took photos of the mass gainer tub, the notebook still open in my other hand. Everything. He reached for my phone, but I stepped back and told him I was leaving tonight and he couldn't stop me. He tried to get out of bed, moving faster than I'd seen him move in a year, and I backed toward the door. He said if I left he really would die, that I was murdering him by abandoning him, and I told him good luck with that and walked out. I called Roxana from my car and asked if I could come over right now, and she said yes without asking questions. I threw clothes in garbage bags, grabbed my laptop and documents, and was out of that house in 20 minutes. My father followed me around the whole time, not wheezing or clutching his chest, just walking normally and begging. He said he'd get help, he'd lose the weight, he'd do anything if I just stayed 6 more months. I ignored him and kept packing. When I loaded the last bag in my car, he stood in the driveway and said I was just like my mother, selfish and heartless. I told him Mom was smart to leave and I should have done it 2 years ago. That night at Roxana's apartment, I couldn't sleep because my phone kept buzzing with his texts. He sent photos of Mom, old family pictures, then switched to saying I was killing him and his blood would be on my hands. Around midnight, I blocked his number and finally fell asleep on Roxana's couch. The next morning, I woke up to Roxana shaking my shoulder and pointing out her window. My father's car was parked in the lot below, had been there since sometime during the night. I could see his shape behind the wheel, just sitting there. Roxana asked if she should call the cops, but I said no, let him sit. I finished packing the rest of my stuff that I'd left at Roxana's over the past few days, organized my documents for MIT, and the whole time I could see his car down there. He sat for 3 hours while I moved around the apartment, and every time I looked out the window, he was still there. Around noon, his headlights came on and he pulled out of the parking lot. I watched him drive away and felt something break loose in my chest that had been stuck there for 2 years, this weight I'd been carrying that finally lifted. Roxana hugged me and said I was brave, but I didn't feel brave, just tired and relieved and scared about what came next. I left for MIT at 6 the next morning before my father could show up again. My car was packed, so full I could barely see out the back window. Everything I owned stuffed into garbage bags and boxes. The first hour I cried so hard I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see the road. I cried for the dad I thought I had, the one who actually needed me, not the one who trapped me on purpose. I cried for the 2 years I lost, for my senior year and my friends and all the normal experiences I missed. But somewhere around the state border, the tears stopped, and I felt this weird lightness in my chest. I turned up the radio and rolled down the windows, and for the first time in forever, I felt excited about my future, instead of scared. My phone rang, and I almost didn't answer until I saw it was Uncle Corey. He said my father had called him that morning asking for money, claiming he couldn't afford food or rent without my help. Corey told him he'd connect him with social services and food assistance programs, but my father got angry and said he needed family support, not charity. Corey asked if I was okay, and I told him I was driving to MIT right now, and I felt better than I had in years. He said he was proud of me and he'd keep tabs on my father, but I shouldn't feel guilty about leaving. I thanked him and hung up and kept driving, watching the miles add up between me and that house. MIT's campus was bigger than I expected, and I got lost twice trying to find my dorm. When I finally found it and started unloading my car, other students and their parents were everywhere, taking photos and crying happy tears. I felt weird being alone, but also relieved I didn't have to manage my father's performance for a crowd. My roommate was already moved in when I got to our room, a girl named Jessica, who immediately started talking about how nervous she was about classes and how much she missed her dog. She asked about my family, and I just said they couldn't make it, which was true enough. Jessica helped me unpack and chatted about normal things like which dining hall had the best food and whether we should get a mini fridge. I didn't tell her my story, didn't mention my father or the past 2 years. I just wanted to be a regular student for a while, to have regular problems and complain about regular things. My father called twice during my first week, and I didn't answer either time. But I did call Dr. Ferguson to check in, and he told me my father had been to one appointment and was managing his medications on his own. It wasn't great progress, but it was something. Proof he could actually take care of himself when he had to. I realized I could track his well-being without being his caretaker, that I could care about him without sacrificing myself. The guilt was still there, sitting heavy in my stomach, but it was manageable now. I met with an MIT counselor the second week, a woman in her 50s who specialized in family issues. I told her everything, showed her the photos of the notebook and the mass gainer, explained the 2 years of fake emergencies. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said what my father did was a form of abuse, even though it didn't look like traditional abuse. She said manipulation and control were abuse, that trapping someone through guilt and lies was abuse, and that I had every right to leave. She told me the guilt I felt was normal, that it showed I cared, but caring didn't mean I had to destroy my own life. Hearing her say it was abuse helped more than I expected, gave me permission to be angry instead of just sad. 3 weeks into the semester, I realized I was thriving in ways I didn't think possible. My classes were challenging but exciting. All these problems I could actually solve with equations and logic instead of impossible situations with no right answers. I made friends with people in my dorm, went to study groups, ate meals in the dining hall without having to cut up someone else's food first. I slept through the night for the first time in years. No one calling for help at 3 a.m., no medical emergencies to manage. I still thought about my father every day, but the guilt was becoming more manageable, less like drowning and more like a dull ache I could live with. Uncle Corey started sending me updates every few weeks. In October, he told me my father had lost about 30 pounds, was seeing a therapist twice a month, and had joined some virtual support group for food addiction. Corey warned me not to expect miracles, said recovery wasn't a straight line, and my father could relapse into old patterns anytime. But it was more than my father had ever done before, actual effort instead of promises. I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me hoping he'd really change, and part of me too tired to care. The letter came in mid-October, forwarded from our old address to my dorm. I recognized my father's handwriting on the envelope and almost threw it away without opening it. But curiosity won, and I read it in my room while Jessica was at class. It was different from his previous texts and calls. No manipulation or guilt trips or dramatic claims about dying. He wrote that he was wrong, that he'd been selfish and cruel, and he was trying to do better. He didn't ask me to come home or forgive him or even respond. He just said he was proud I got away and he hoped I was happy. I read it 3 times looking for the trap, the hidden manipulation, but it seemed genuine. That scared me more than his anger had. I didn't respond to the letter right away because I needed time to figure out if this was real change or just another tactic. I talked to Eric on the phone and he suggested I wait and see if the changes stuck before I re-engaged. He said my father might be genuine or he might be trying a new approach after the old ones failed, and only time would tell which. I realized I was okay with whatever happened, that my happiness wasn't dependent on my father's recovery anymore. Whether he got better or stayed the same or got worse, I was building a life that was mine, and nothing he did could take that away from me now. When Thanksgiving week arrived, I told my roommate I was staying on campus instead of going home, and felt this weird sense of relief wash over me. The dining hall set up a special dinner for students who stayed, and about 20 of us showed up, most of us looking a little awkward about being there. We sat at long tables and someone started talking about their complicated relationship with their stepmom, and suddenly everyone was sharing stories about their messy families without any judgment. I told them a simplified version of my situation, and this guy from California nodded and said his dad did something similar with a fake back injury. Nobody acted like I was a terrible person for leaving, and I realized this was the first Thanksgiving in 3 years where I wasn't cleaning up after someone or managing a medical crisis. The turkey was dry and the stuffing was bland, but I ate 3 plates because I could actually taste the food instead of choking it down between emergencies. I called my father that evening from my dorm room, my hands shaking a little as I hit his number. He answered on the second ring and his voice sounded different, clearer somehow. Less of that breathy quality he used to have. He told me about his therapy sessions and how he'd lost another 10 pounds, and when I asked how he was really doing, he actually answered instead of deflecting. Then he asked about my classes, and I started telling him about my computer science project, waiting for him to interrupt and turn it back to himself like he always did. But he just listened and asked questions that showed he was paying attention, and when we hung up 20 minutes later, I sat staring at my phone, because that felt like talking to a completely different person. It was a small thing, him actually listening, but it made me think maybe Eric was right about real change being possible. Uncle Corey showed up at MIT in early December, taking me out for coffee at this place near campus. He'd driven up from Connecticut to check on me and said he'd been talking to my father every few weeks. Corey told me my father was down 50 pounds total now, had gotten a part-time remote job doing data entry, and was actually showing up to his therapy appointments and support group meetings. He pulled out his phone and showed me a recent photo of my father, and I barely recognized him, his face less puffy and his eyes more focused. But then Corey leaned forward and said, I needed to understand that recovery wasn't a straight line, that my father could easily fall back into old patterns if things got hard. He said he was cautiously optimistic, but I shouldn't expect miracles or think everything was fixed just because my father was making progress now. I appreciated that Corey wasn't trying to push me toward reconciliation or make me feel guilty, just giving me the facts and letting me decide what to do with them. Finals week hit, and I buried myself in studying, spending long nights in the library with my new friends. When grades posted in mid-December, I'd gotten 3 A's and 1 B+, which felt impossible after missing so much school my senior year. My roommate and I went out to celebrate with some people from our floor, and I realized I'd built this whole life at MIT that was completely separate from my father and his problems. The guilt was still there when I thought about him, sitting in that house alone managing his own care, but it felt different now. I could hold both truths at the same time, that leaving him was the right choice for me, and that it was still hard and painful to have done it. Eric had told me that was what growth looked like, being able to sit with complicated feelings instead of trying to make them simple, and I was starting to understand what he meant. Spring semester started, and my father called me on a Sunday afternoon in late January. We talked about surface-level stuff, his job and my classes and the weather, neither of us bringing up what had happened or trying to force anything deeper. He told me he'd started working with a nutritionist who was helping him plan actual meals instead of just ordering whatever he wanted, and he'd lost 70 pounds total now. I could hear the pride in his voice when he said it, and I told him I was proud of him too, meaning it for the first time. We started doing these weekly calls where we just talked like normal people, and while he was still obese and still had a long way to go, he was making real progress instead of just promising to change. Sometimes he'd slip and start talking about how hard things were in a way that felt like he was fishing for sympathy, but then he'd catch himself and move on instead of spiraling into manipulation. In early April, I decided to invite him to visit MIT for a weekend, my stomach tight with anxiety as I typed out the text. I told him he could come, but I was setting some boundaries, that he'd need to stay in a hotel and manage his own transportation, and if things went badly, I'd ask him to leave. I also texted Uncle Corey and asked if he could be on standby in case my father showed up and started his old patterns again. My father responded an hour later saying he'd love to come and he understood the boundaries, and 2 weeks later he texted me his flight information. The fact that he'd booked a flight and made hotel arrangements by himself, without asking me to help or claiming he couldn't figure it out, felt like proof that he really was capable of more than he'd pretended before. The weekend he visited was awkward, but not terrible, which felt like a win given everything that had happened between us. He met me at my dorm on Saturday morning and I barely recognized him, down almost 90 pounds now and moving without that exaggerated struggle he used to perform. We walked around campus and I introduced him to some friends I ran into, and he was polite and normal instead of making everything about himself or his health. He asked to sit in on one of my lectures and I snuck him into my algorithms class, watching him take notes like he was genuinely interested in what the professor was saying. That afternoon we got coffee and he apologized again for what he'd done, but this time he didn't ask for forgiveness or try to explain it away. He just said he was sorry and he understood if I never fully trusted him again, and he wasn't going to ask me to come home or take care of him, because that wasn't my job. Hearing him say that out loud, admitting that he'd been wrong to make me his caretaker, felt like the most genuine proof of change he could have given me. As my freshman year wrapped up, I started planning to take summer classes at MIT instead of going home, and when I told my father, he said that made sense and he hoped I'd have a good summer. No guilt trip, no crying about being alone, no manufactured emergency to try to make me change my mind. We were building this new relationship that was based on honesty instead of manipulation, him in his house working on his recovery, and me at the school building my future. It wasn't perfect, and I still felt twinges of guilt sometimes when I thought about how I'd left, but it was real in a way our relationship had never been before. He was taking responsibility for himself, and I was taking responsibility for my own life, and while I didn't know if we'd ever be close again, at least we were finally being honest with each other. That felt like enough for now. Maybe even like the beginning of something better than what we'd had before.